All right. So as I often say when I teach classes like this, there are two models of this kind of thing. One is the Socratic model, which is what I came through in law school, where the teacher, with plenty of surprise and without any warning, calls on people to talk about some aspect of what we're working on, and particularly tries to find people who are sleeping or dozing or not otherwise paying attention. And the other side of it, which is what we will be doing, of course, is the more often and the more immediately that I am interrupted with discussion, the better this is by a country mile. All right, having said that, there are two separate Mishnayot that I wanted to spend some time on today. One, hardly at all. And the other, I think, will probably take us into some interesting discussion. The hardly at all, I would refer you to chapter 3, Perek 6, I guess Pasuk 6, which is on page 244 of Lev Shalem. And I don't know what it is in Sim Shalom, if anybody has that.
I do.
65.
Okay.
Are you going to have it on screen?
So now,
Actually, Frank, if you don't mind, before you begin, I just have a really quick question about last week.
go ahead.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we defined what tzibur is in terms of, excuse me, in terms of the righteous, the middle group and the wicked group. But overall, what is the tzibur? Is it just the Jewish people or the world entire? And I don't mean that to take up the discussion today. I just want to throw that out for people to think about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Judith.
It's a good.
Roberta,
All right, so that Pasuk 6, which is Nechunya ben Hakana taught, whoever accepts the yoke of Torah will be spared the burdens of citizenship. That gets to tzibur, actually, and of earning a livelihood. But whoever throws off the yoke of Torah will have to bear the burdens of citizenship and of earning a livelihood. When I first read that, I have to tell you, it sort of struck me as, wait a minute, this is saying basically that the modality of and I will use a term here that I don't want to really get into much, but the Haredi in Israel, who study to the exclusion of earning a living and of participating in civil society, this sort of buttresses that model. And I was a bit puzzled by it, but then I did a little bit of looking. And if you look at the bottom of page 244, there's actually some way of getting at it, although the research I did answered the question, which is they're not talking about actually being, having your obligations obviated, of having to be part of a society and having to earn a living, etc. What they're saying is if you study Torah, those obligations will not seem like obligations to you. They will seem like pleasant things to do because the study of Torah makes everything so pleasant. Now, if anybody wants to talk about that, we can, although I want to focus on a different verse. So let me just throw it out for a second and see if anybody has any thoughts on that. Or is it a strange reading of that provision, of that teaching?
Last week, we mentioned in chapter 2, the second verse, part of it says, study of Torah is commendable when combined with a gainful occupation. For when a person toils in both, sin is driven out of mind. Study alone without an occupation leads to idleness and ultimately to sin. So I think I find this often in Pirkei Avot that some seem to contradict or provide a broader view. So I sort of like your interpretation about doing the other work with, joy or whatever.
Yeah, I had to search a little bit to find it. And many of you could probably guess where I found it, which is in a Chabad link. One can find an awful lot there. if nothing else, if you're looking for something, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, you'll find something. All right, now turn the page. At least in Lev Shalem, it's actually a couple of page turns. It goes over to, it's backwards. That's a page turn backward. It's chapter 3, verse 2, pasuk 2. Rabbi Hananiah, the deputy high priest, taught, pray for the welfare of the government. For if people did not fear it, they would swallow each other alive. Now, that's obviously a very simple 3-line statement, but it is, I think, fraught with meaning and fraught with ways of interpretation, etc. So I looked to begin with, figure out we go from right to left in Hebrew. So I picked up the Birnbaum Siddur. Anybody know Philip Birnbaum Siddur? For me, some of you probably.
Yes, I know the burned down
Yeah.
door.
It's not the art scroll, to say the least, but it is a reflection from the 50s, I think is what it goes back to, of American modern orthodoxy. And if you go to some of the pages immediately following the Torah reading, while the Torah is still out, and this would be after the Haftarah, where we have a prayer for our country, which I will get to in our Siddur, and prayer for the state of Israel, etc. There is what's called in Birnbaum, prayer for the government, not prayer for the country, prayer for the government. And there's an interesting little comment on it, Birnbaum. Well, it starts actually in Hebrew, anotain teshuah, and Birnbaum says this has undergone several verbal variations in the course of time. The custom to pray for the welfare of the government is based on Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, which translates to seek the welfare of the country where I have sent you into exile, where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for your welfare depends on its welfare. And then there are various versions of it, and I'm going to actually look at a few of them here. So Birnbaum says the following, and I realize I don't have it on the screen, but the point I'm going to make, and the part that I'm particularly interested in, is very short. It may he who granted victory to kings, dominion to princes, etc., etc., he who delivered his servant David from the evil sword, may he bless and protect, help and exalt. And this is indented in bold print in Birnbaum, the president and the vice president and all the officers of this country. And then he goes on to say, may God in his mercy sustain them, deliver them from all distress and misfortune, and may God inspire them and all their counselors and aides to deal kindly with us and with all Israel. Now, that is a very traditional rendering of the prayer for the government. It is a prayer that you will see in Orthodox Siddurim. And I can remember, actually, it's a few years now, but I was at a service at, what's the synagogue in the Upper West Side, near, not far from Lincoln Center, Lincoln Square Synagogue, modern Orthodox, and this was read. So the idea that we need to be, we are beholden to the government is an idea that, of course, in one respect, it comes from Galut, from being in exile, not having our own land. This was written, incidentally, let me look at the copyright for a second on Birnbaum. I think it may be, all right, the original copyright, 1949, immediately after the founding of the state of Israel, immediately, and probably not really reflecting the state of Israel, because this prayer it comes from a series of sources, of biblical sources. Now, if we take that and go to in Lev Shalem, many of you are familiar with this, to page 177. We all hear this every Shabbat morning. There's somebody who reads it. Oftentimes it's a member of the Bar Bat Mitzvah family. Oftentimes it's actually somebody who doesn't know much Hebrew. We always read it in English. And there's, besides its text, there is some commentary on the far right-hand side of the page, which is the typical way that Lev Shalem works. And on the left side of the page is some oftentimes alternative renditions of what we're talking about. So interestingly, on that page 177 at the top, we always read a prayer for our country, which is the main large print material in the middle of the page. On the left side of the page, though, is a much smaller print prayer, which is entitled Alternative Prayer for Our Country. Now, I want to read just a little bit of it and then invite some discussion. But before I do that, on the right-hand side, as I said, there often is some commentary on what is being read, chanted, davened in the center of the page. This particular comment, I am 99% sure, but not 100%, was written by Gordon Tucker, Rabbi Gordon Tucker. Many of you will know who he is. He is a Dean Emeritus of the Rabbinical School at JTS. He is Rabbi Emeritus, Senior Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Israel Center in Scarsdale.
White Plains.
Well, I know, but
Close enough.
yeah,
Westchester County.
it's on the
Go ahead.
border. Roberta, it's on the border. They would
It would have been White Plains, Scarsdale. Go
they
ahead.
would have preferred that we say Scarsdale. But you're a good geographician. So anyway, I'm going to read just a little bit. Secure governments was seen as providing safety for the Jewish community, and a biblical warrant for such prayers was found in Jeremiah's instruction. That's what Birnbaum talked about, Jeremiah. That we should seek the welfare of the city to which I've exiled you and pray to Adonai on its behalf for its prosperity. If it prospers, you prosper. Now, that's good. One thing, a thought that comes to my mind when you hear that is, well, when our country prospers, do we prosper better? Probably yes. If you go back to Weimar Germany, Germany was prospering actually until that rampant inflation of the 20s. And the ultimate lack of success of the Weimar Republic was the Jewish community of Germany post-World War I doing okay? Probably, until Germany began to suffer. Obviously, I don't want to, that's not our subject today, and that could be another whole subject. Now, the actual prayer for our country has the following text, and I'm obviously pulling from it, but I want to focus on something here. Many of you will recognize this in what we read every Shabbat. Pour out your blessing upon this land, upon its inhabitants, and upon its leaders, its judges, officers, and officials who faithfully devote themselves to the needs of the public. Help them understand the rules of justice. Is that a word we've been hearing recently? The rules of justice you have decreed, so that peace and security, happiness and freedom will never depart from our land. Justice leading to peace and security, happiness and freedom. And then in the next paragraph, we pray that your spirit be awakened within all the inhabitants of our land. That excludes nobody. And uproot from our hearts hatred and malice. Now, the alternative prayer that we never read, one of these days, maybe somebody who's reading it, it's the same page, it's the left side of the page, may do this. The middle paragraph says, may our judges, elected leaders, and all who hold public office exercise their responsibilities with wisdom, fairness, and justice for all. And then in the next paragraph, in other words, we're talking about not just may this country be good, may we pray for the success of the country and the beneficence of the country and the compassion of the country, but those who are in a position to affect that should be prayed for. But then the next paragraph, creator and protector of all, watch over our armed forces and all those entrusted with our safety. as they daily put their lives at risk to protect us and our freedoms. Be with them in times of danger, give them courage to act with honor and dignity, as well as insight to do what is right in your eyes. Is this not speaking to us directly today about policing, for example? Oh, our armed forces and those entrusted with our safety who daily put their lives at risk. This was written in 2016, not that long ago, and probably after some of the activities that consume a lot of news stories. And finally, of the text that I want to just mention, when it comes to the prayer for our country, that was Lev Shalem. This is from Siddur Mishkan Tefillah. You know what that is, I assume. That's the current Siddur of the Reform movement. And anybody who has not studied it is missing something. They have come back so far from what the Union Prayer Book was, that those who were the devotees of the Union Prayer Book of a generation or two ago are now incessantly rolling over in their graves. This is a traditional Siddur. In any event, it says, grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Obviously, the prayer for our country is a prayer that is written by each set of editors of a Siddur for its own constituency. This is not coming from any traditional Hebrew text. All right, so I am welcome to focus on anything anybody thinks of, but for my own, I was really struck by this quote unquote alternative that appears on the left side of page 177 in Lev Shalem. Watch over our armed forces and all those entrusted with our safety as they daily put their lives at risk to protect us and our freedoms. Be with them in times of danger, give them courage to act with honor and dignity, as well as insight to do what is right in your eyes. The actual existence of these words, I think, points to some of what we're seeing today, which is you can't rely on, you can't, whoops. Is it everybody here?
Yeah, I can,
Does anybody hear that noise?
You have two devices going at the same time, I believe.
yeah, mute Roberta.
Okay.
Oh, it's coming from Roberta?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this paragraph, these paragraphs are assuming that there will be some, if not controversy, certainly some question about what those who protect us need to do to be able to do that successfully, and need to confront in themselves, in addition to in the society in which they're functioning. All right. If I'm not getting hands up or people starting to come in and
Frank?
commentary, is that you, Esther?
Yes, Esther G. Well, I mean, I understand that alternative prayer is more specific in ways, but looking at the prayer that we say every week, for example, in the first paragraph, pour out your blessings upon this land, etc., upon its leaders, its judges, officers, and officials, help them understand the rules of justice. Oh, I don't see, to me, that's in there, maybe not as explicit as the alternate, but I feel that that's all embedded.
Oh, I agree with you. The point wasn't that the left side, and I tell you, I'm not sure. The author of a lot of these was Ed Felt, Rabbi Ed Felt from JTS. I'm not sure he wrote both of these, but I agree with you, Esther. Yeah, they were not meant to be, I think, mutually exclusive. But I think the one on the left, the one that in the smaller print, is more specific. It sort of takes the more general and brings it down to a more specific level. And certainly for what we in American society today, and I think in Western society maybe generally, are seeing today is something to which this could be seen to very directly apply, especially the left side.
Okay, so I have a question about that. You said this was written in 2018?
16. This book, let me put it this way. This book is copyright 2016. if you look at the back of the book, you can find sources for much of what is written here. The prayer for our country is not the same as what was in Sim Shalom. It's not, there's some of it is a little bit similar, but it's longer and it's got some different material. And certainly the left side of the page is quite different from what was in the predecessor Siddur for our
Right.
conservative movement.
Okay,
It's also
so-
not the same as what was in the prior Siddur, Sha'arei Tefillah, the prior Siddur of the Reform movement. So I am interpolating, without being certain, that this would have been written in the mid 2010s. That's when the copyright on Lev Shalem is 2016. And I remember going actually, this may put a little meat on this. In fact, Marty, you may have been there, and maybe some others on this, on this class. One of the retreats at Ramah, one of the layman, the old name Layman's Institute, the retreat, Ed Feld was our guest scholar. Marty, you remember that?
Of course.
And at the time, he was, I'm not sure that Lev Shalem had actually come out. Do you recall, Marty?
It was about to come out.
It was about to, and he spent, I think, all of his lectures, and class sessions, talking with us about the creation and production of Lev Shalem. And among other things, he mentioned how much of the material like this, not traditional Hebrew text, although some translations certainly, but prayers of this nature, which are meant to be read in English and which are designed for a modern situation and change with every Siddur, were being written at that very time.
Okay, so my question.
Wait a minute, hang on a second, Judith. Let Maida share.
Sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say that what I see in this back from the times of Pirkei Avot is an arc that has to do with when it is the country in which we live, and then when it becomes our country. Because of the huge history of Jews living in diaspora and always being dependent on the king or the ruler to ensure some level of safety within the community. And I think what's fascinating about these different versions of relatively modern texts is how much it becomes our country, not the country in which we're living. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And that the demands are escalating. I just think it's a fascinating
I agree with you, Maida.
sociological comment, that's all.
Incidentally,
Sorry, Judith, I didn't mean to speak over you.
No, that's
Actually,
quite all
can
right,
I-
because actually, it sort of touches on what I wanted to say. First of all, to respond to you, Maida, and I cannot cite sources. I'm never able to do that, but somewhere in Talmud, there it says, Dina da'ara dina, which means the law of the land is law, which
Yes.
means that we accept the society overall in which we live, not just our own isolated Jewish society. So this would be an extension of that we have to pray for the welfare of the land that we live in. Because if we are subject to its laws, then we also need to pray for its welfare. But specifically with regard to the variant versions of the prayer for our country, I was just wondering, and again, because I don't have a really good sense of time this way, what was happening in the early to mid 2000s that would have provoked a specific prayer for our armed forces? And then again, is it the United States Armed Forces or the Israeli Armed Forces? Because it's questionable. I think it could go either way.
well, let me, Judith, let me answer that at least a little bit when it comes to the Israeli armed forces. Because if you turn the page in Lev
I
Shalem,
don't think
Right,
that's
yeah,
what
and
it
of
is.
course.
I think
No.
this is an American situation.
That's good,
I
but
don't want to go down this way.
no,
I
but
think
well,
it's
I can
really-
answer in 1 minute. The next
Okay.
page has Tfilat L'Shalom Medinat Yisrael, and that
Right.
mentions the Israeli army. That
Thank
makes
you.
how. So,
That's an art scroll too,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
which
And
came
that's-
from Sinai.
sorry, I should not. It's,
Who else wants
you're
to
right,
weigh in?
I just wasn't thinking. Okay,
All
sorry
right, how
about
about
that.
Yaira?
Oh,
No, don't
Judith,
say it.
Judith,
Judith, are
I
you
didn't-
crazy?
I
Don't say
wasn't-
that.
I didn't mean, 1 second.
No, I just, I know about the prayer for the Jewish armed forces. I just wasn't putting two and two together.
All right, how about anybody else want to share? Let's have Yaira or Yael or Roberta, Carol, or Esther, Siegel, anybody else?
I just wanted to point out that the Sidur Lev Shalem came out after the Machzor Lev Shalem, which came out, about 2010 or a
2010.
little earlier. I was just walking around looking for a copy of it.
2010, roughly.
Okay, so we know that we have that a little bit, that appearing a little bit earlier. Just a point. So Frank, your point is in, can you help us?
Yeah, well, let me say a couple of things, just a couple of small points. One thing you notice about the prayer for our country, in all of its versions, it doesn't actually mention the country, the United States. It refers to our country, and that's no accident, because they want it to be applicable if you're sitting in Canada in particular, of course, because this is a prayer book used by Canadian Jews as well. And that's actually in somewhat contrast. In England, there is a prayer for the king and queen, for the queen, the royalty in England. How they're dealing with the death of Prince Philip, I don't know, and that's not, we don't have to worry about that. So now, did you ask another question, Roberta?
I was just saying, let some other people chime in if they'd like. Who wants to?
Nada?
What? No, well,
I've already
We'll give a
spoken.
shot.
I have a point about what was going on in history at that
Oh,
point.
yes. Why don't you make that point, Meta, because it's very useful.
I mean, how could we miss that given the news of this week, right? It's
Well, that's
it's
exactly what I was
Afghanistan.
saying.
Yeah, it's Afghanistan. It's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, people were going off to war. And it's also 9/11, which is theoretically what launched Afghanistan. That's the 20 years ago. That's
But that's not
maybe
this.
why this is.
But I don't think this was written 20 years ago. I think it was written more like, I mean, if you take Machzor Lev Shalem, that was 10 years ago.
No, we're not talking about Lev Shalem anymore, Frank.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry.
Okay.
No, but also,
No,
hold
no,
on.
I'm gonna back up because I feel like we've got threads that are not talking to each other. So I'll stop.
No,
This is
no,
the
no, we are.
problem. This is the problem
Mida,
of Zoom.
we most definitely are talking the same language. But the thing is that a publication date doesn't mean what was going on at that moment. Given how long it takes to produce a new Machzor or a new Sidur, it's things that were going on at least 5 years, if not more, before publication.
I think that's
date.
correct.
We move on.
May I, excuse
So
me,
Mida, you're right. You know, what was going on 20 years ago does matter.
All right, let Esther, please. Esther Freiberg, please.
Can we move on, please? Because I'm falling asleep with that back and forth.
What?
I'm sorry.
Hello?
Esther, first of all, back away from your microphone a little bit. What Esther's saying is she's requesting that we leave the topic.
And move on.
To a different aspect of Pirkei Avot, of chapter
Yes,
3?
please.
Well, can I just say that we haven't really finished this one in the
Oh, we have
second
not.
part
My intention was to spend a little more time in this, actually.
on 2. So Frank, I want to ask you the second part of 2, pray for the welfare of the government, for if people did not fear it, they would swallow each other alive. So
Well,
I
thank
have
you,
a
Esther.
couple
you.
commentaries on that, but I wanted to hear what you and people thought about that part. What, separate from the prayer that we say, the implications of that. What does this mean? We'd swallow each other alive if we didn't fear our government.
Well, when I first read that, and I'm not, it's not as if I wasn't familiar with this previously, but when I first thought about it, one of the things that came to my mind was the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, which you will all recall has a phrase, to form a more perfect union and to create a society in which each person is able to pursue happiness for him or herself. This swallowing each other alive reminds me of the dichotomy between what some American society would call, quote unquote, the golden rule, which we just was in today's Torah portion, although we didn't read it in what we read. Love your neighbor as yourself, which Jesus propounded as the golden rule, and Christians look at it that way. But Hillel actually, when asked how to explain Judaism on one foot or one leg, his answer was, do not do unto anybody else that which is hateful to you. The rest is all commentary, go learn it. He took the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, and turned it into a negative, I think partly on the theory that loving your neighbor creates a whole issue of how one loves. How does one love one's neighbor? But not doing something distasteful, that's distasteful to you, to your neighbor, makes it very concrete. Well, if you now go over to the second part of this particular verse, this particular Mishnah, for if people did not fear it, they would swallow each other alive. This is the negative of the welfare of the government. It's without a sound government, the human nature of people is to get at each other's throats, to coin an expression. And while this may be very strong language, swallow each other alive, the fact that we have a system of law, that's the principal thing. I come from that, obviously. I practiced law for 47 years and retired a little under 2 years ago. But think of the anarchy that would be in effect if that were not the case. And just to put this in more concrete terms, and I don't want to get political in this, but we know, we've seen in the last few months, some areas of this country where a decision was made, maybe not wholly consciously, to let law lapse a little bit. And you then go into some of these communities where the police sort of laid back and let things go. I think that a good metaphor for what went on there would be people swallowing each other alive. There is a role for the government, and the praying for it is very, I think, legitimate. That's at least my initial take on the second half. Marty, you want to call anybody, or Esther, you raised that, you thoughts on that the second part of that pasuk?
Anybody else want to chime in? Now's your time. Carol, Gail. Okay, hearing none. Judith, go ahead.
I wasn't going to say anything in particular, but it's pretty obvious, given in the United States too, that without law, we're going to swallow each other alive. I mean, people are killing people for no particular reason that I can see, at least. And not that the police can see either. We're constantly hearing reports about a shooting and no motive in sight.
That's interesting because, I think to convict somebody of murder, and if anybody in this class has any criminal law ability or background or knowledge, come rescue me. That was not my field. But in order to convict somebody where the charge is intentional murder, whether it be first or second degree, you need to have a motive. And Judith, you raised the point, people seem to be doing it without motive. There's just, I suppose the notion random comes into effect. And that, I think, is what this is speaking to some extent. They would swallow each other alive. You have random chaos as it were. But that raises the question, which is a good segue here. Is human nature such over all of humanity? You go back to the beginnings of Genesis, the Bereshit. Is human nature such that we need the strictures of government, of police, even of armed forces, to not swallow each other alive? I would say that, ask that in both a literal sense and a figurative sense. Is that the way we all
Are
are?
swallowing ourselves alive. When you think about January 6th, we had deaths of policemen that were trying to protect us. They were threatening the vice president of the United States and the House Speaker of the House. I mean, those are pretty high level officials that I shudder to think what would have happened if they actually had their way, where they're going through the calls, hang Mike Pence, where's Nancy Pelosi? So I think that's pretty swallowing alive. And then society is swallowing alive because we still have these random killings. I'm not talking about George Floyd. I'm talking about the guy that went into the FedEx in Indianapolis and shot up his employees, including Sikhs. There's so many different random shootings. The one in Colorado, and was it Boulder? I don't know where.
Boulder
It was Boulder. Okay, anyway, but
and Florida. I mean,
But-
the Parkman, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school, all of these different ones. I think we are, and it doesn't matter whether the laws are on the books or not because they don't follow them anyway.
No, Marty, I'm
Chicago,
asking a
let me just finish my
question.
sentence. Let me finish my sentence.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Example, Chicago has one of the highest murder rates in the country and have some of the strictest gun laws. So, I think we are swallowing ourselves alive in a very slow sense.
And the question I'm asking is, those are the facts. Underneath it, though, is that human nature?
Could I address that for a second?
Sure.
Yera, go ahead. We haven't heard from Yera. Unmute, please.
No, that was Esther. Oh,
Oh, Yera had her hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go for it.
You're muted. Yera, you're muted.
Yera, hang on, Yera. Maybe I'll mute
you
you.
have to do it.
Go for it. Start again, please.
Okay,
Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Good to see
Shalom.
everybody. I wonder if fascinating as this conversation is, and it truly is, and it's very timely and it's very up to the minute. But I've been sitting here and I've just been sitting with the text as we have it. And to my mind, the simple reading of the text is a little more parochial than what our more universal conversation has been touching on. And that is thinking about ourselves, the Jewish people, having guest status in one country after another, after another, after another. Our well-being was completely dependent upon the forces that be keeping order. Because if things got out of hand, they might not immediately target us, but sooner or later, they were going to find their way to our storefronts, our homes, our so on and so forth. And I would like to hear us perhaps talk about, I think there's still a lot of that we carry with us, maybe less so in the generations that are coming after us. But I know that I am mindful of some of the things that my grandmother would say about, she was very, very proud of having been born here in America. But I always got from her the sense that we would have to head for the border at a moment's notice. And that usually surrounded conversations that we had when we were polishing the silver. And she would say, even a stupid border guard knows the value of a silver spoon. And then we'd just go on. So I wonder if we've gotten so comfortable as being fully emancipated Jews of the 21st century that, are we connected? Do we have to be connected to the insecurity of our past guest status in various countries? So that's what I've been mulling on. I can see everybody. Mhm.
Well,
That's a lot to chew on, actually. It certainly in this country, I mean, and I've heard this come from our pulpit. Having studied a fair amount of American Jewish history, and some other Jewish history as well, I think that our position here, vis-a-vis our position in every other land we have been in, except the state of Israel, is unique. And it's actually unique even vis-a-vis the state of Israel, because the state of Israel is our state. It's our country. But this country, notwithstanding some of what we see today, notwithstanding some of what many of us may have seen as we grew up, is still a country that doesn't have at its core a sense of, I'll use a word I don't like, but I'll use it anyway, systemic anti-Semitism. Europe surely has that, has always had that. This country, particularly with the First Amendment of the Constitution, and particularly with somebody like George Washington, who wrote so nicely about the Torah synagogue, doesn't really have that. Does that mean it's perfect for us? Absolutely not. There's certainly, look, we don't have to look very far to see synagogue bombings, to see people using words.
Well, I'll even go more recent than that. January 6th, Camp Auschwitz.
Yes.
Counselor.
Right, but somebody mentioned that. I don't think that the people January 6th running, let me not say I don't think. I would ask the question, are the people rampaging through DC, January 6th, are they emblematic of, number one, American society, and number two, human nature in general? The question I was asking before, is human nature such that we would each, without some government influence, swallow each other alive? If you look, Gordon Tucker has a little piece here about this prayer for the government, in which he says, this teaching of Hananiah assumes a view of human nature that we normally associate with Thomas Hobbes. People would devour each other in a riot of cutthroat zero-sum competition were it not for some entity that has a monopoly of power sufficient to hold back those forces. And so we should pray for the welfare of that entity. He's saying, yeah, human nature is such that without governing authority, in whatever forms that takes, and boy, it takes a lot of forms over the throughout history and throughout even the world today. Without that, people would act in ways that are very deleterious to other people.
Let's have Esther Freiberg and then Maida, please.
The only thing I would like to say, we Jews don't learn from history. So German Jews also were thinking they are in the golden land. We had a lot of anti-Semitism here, and we don't look at the face of it. And I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I wish we were more conscientious about what's going on in this country. Thanks.
Well, I see what you're saying, Esther. And I think there's a difference, though, between, as I mentioned before, between Germany in the early 20th century and the United States, having to do with the fact that all of Europe has had, from the Middle Ages, a sort of an undercurrent of anti-Semitism. That, while there's certainly anti-Semitism in this country, it is not endemic anti-Semitism.
Frank?
It's spots. It's sort of single examples, multiple examples, but not through society. I say
Maida,
that.
please. Maida, please.
Frank, I just have to say this. I think that what we're experiencing now is some residual from 4 years when the government was not acting to keep down the worst of our violence.
Yeah,
Okay. And I think that when Charlottesville happened, and they were very nice people, I'm trying not to be political, but when the head of the country said there are very nice people on both sides, that was a clear indication that the government would not step in. I also think that a lot of the friends of the Jews in the United States, because of their deep interest in Israel, the whole evangelical Christian piece, which is a very significant part of the United States of America,
very significant. Yes.
has the potential to shift, because the second part of the story after the rapture is that the Jews are gone. Okay, so
That,
I love you to death, but
Death.
you have to be careful. And I think something like these prayers is unbelievably important, because the government itself is the thing at its best that stands between the worst of human nature, but at its worst does not.
of
I
course.
agree. I agree
There are
100%.
governments and there are governments, of course.
No,
And
but
I
Frank,
think that one of, maybe you've helped spark the other part of this. And I think that whether we're looking at this teaching from Pirkei Avot to jumping ahead to the prayer that we say for our country, whatever country we happen to be residing in the moment, doesn't have to impugn the motives of the country, but simply to make that distinction in our minds that we are a minority. We have always been a minority. Chances are we're always going to be a minority, and therefore we are dependent in some part on the largesse of the government to keep us safe, whether it's from the riots that we saw where they were marching around with their tiki torches and the rest of it. And I think that, you know, some of us who may have felt more American than Americans, as someone of German heritage, I think that what is interesting throughout Pirkei Avot, there is a repetition of the importance of recognizing, maintaining, respecting clear boundaries. What is mine to do and what is not mine to do. And I think that one of the more important messages tucked into this teaching is, let's hope that you all live in a time of peace, a time of mutual respect and social interactions and all the other sweet things that we enjoy. But I think there's a reminder tucked in there saying, we are not the majority culture.
Well, that's one of the reasons for the prayer.
Berta.
You know, I want to mention one thing about the rapture.
Folks, Frank, may I just, one moment, please. What I wanted to do was go back to the Pirkei Avot, to the Mishnah that says, the person who accepts the yoke of Torah will be relieved from the yoke of government, but whoever throws aside the yoke of Torah will be burdened by the yoke of government, by the responsibility of government. This is what we're talking about, the Pirkei Avot. So the person it's saying here who spends their life studying the Torah, you don't have to worry about your responsibility for government. But if you don't do that, you do have to participate in the government itself. We're not talking about the government towards the Jews. We're talking about the Jews' responsibility towards participation in the community, whether it's the Pirkei Avot, whether it's the responsibility of study, or whether it's the responsibility of participating in the government. That's what the Pirkei Avot is talking about, the individual Jew's responsibility. What is our responsibility? Frank, you're a lawyer in America. What is your responsibility towards America?
Your responsibility, you are a citizen in this country, and your responsibility is to make this the best place it can be. Make your little area of it the best place that it can be. You do tikkun olam as much as you can, and the study, as I said at the beginning of this class, is not mutually exclusive from citizenship. The burden of citizenship, the burden of secular society is less of a burden in terms of how one perceives it, to the extent one is also a student of Jewish studies. They're not mutually exclusive. They work in a symbiotic relationship. And there's a phrase, which I think it's also in Pirkei Avot, I think. Do not separate oneself from the community. That's part and parcel.
Sadly, our hours come to an end, but thank you, Frank, for your wonderful leadership here in this session.
Well,
And
thank you, everybody.
that participated. And we'll pick it up again next week.